In this guide, we'll go over all of the actions the Sage learns from level 70 to 90 in order. We will go over how each action is meant to be used and, when applicable, the recommended way to use it. In the summary, we will take time to outline both an opener, general rotation, and healing strategies. We will also briefly look into stat priorities. I will assume you have already seen my primer, which covers the level 70 experience specifically, and I will also assume that you are acquainted with abbreviations like GCD, OGCD, and weaving. I will also at most briefly cover general healer mechanics. If any of these things are not familiar to you, please view the videos in the top right corner, those being the level 70 primer, my GCD guide, and my healer basics guide. Let's start with level 72, where your doses, phlegma, and of course Eucrasian doses upgrades to doses 2, Eucrasian doses 2, and phlegma 2. The main difference here is that Eucrasian doses 2 is better than Dyscrasia on 2 targets if it lasts at least 18 seconds and 3 targets after 27 seconds. Phlegma 2's damage is so high that you should make time to use it on cooldown, just like Phlegma 1. Toxicon's damage is also increased significantly, however, at this stage it should still primarily be used as a mobility option. Toxicon does beat Dyscrasia on AoE, so if you have plenty of Adderstings you can benefit from spending them there. While pulling in a dungeon context, it can be beneficial to place Eucrasian doses 2 on 3 or 4 targets as you follow the tank to their destination, and then start spamming Dyscrasia after. At level 74, you learn the ability Rhizomata. This simply enables you to gain a single Addersgall every 90 seconds. The logical conclusion is to use it on cooldown, but sometimes you don't need any Addersgall for a while and then suddenly need multiple. For this reason, I would personally recommend that you only use Rhizomata if you're down to 0 Addersgall, or if you are at 1 and know you will need more in a few seconds. At level 76, you learn Holos, which in addition to healing a decent amount, applies damage reduction that does stack with the damage reduction from Kerachole and Tarocole. In a dungeon setting, you can use this if both Kerachole and Tarocole are on cooldown to continue keeping up the same damage reduction effect for longer, making it easier to keep the tank alive. In a boss or raid setting, Holos can be used when anticipating large raid-wide damage, either alongside Kerachole or in place of Kerachole if it is already on cooldown. This particular ability is likely to be used less often than some of your more potent options, but just don't forget it exists. At level 78, Kerachole is improved to also apply a healing over time effect in addition to the damage reduction. This makes Kerachole do more healing over its duration than Ixochole, although the healing is applied over time. It also makes Kerachole better than Tarocole as long as at least 2 players benefit from the healing. As such, due to the short cooldown and usefulness, you should try to use Kerachole as close to on cooldown as you can and keep the extra Addersgall you get beyond that for the other options. In a boss or raid setting, it may be beneficial to delay Kerachole to just before a big hit is coming up, such that the damage reduction component blunts the damage while still keeping as much of the healing component as possible. At level 80, you learn the ability Panhaima, assuming you completed the job quest line. This works exactly as an AoE version of Haima, although the potency is slightly lower. I recommend using regular Haima as one of the first cooldowns in a dungeon mob pull, but due to the cooldown, you can use Panhaima as the first cooldown on the second pull in quick succession. Try to space them out so you don't end up in a situation where both are far from ready again anytime soon. In a boss or raid setting, Panhaima is best used when anticipating a multi-hit raid-wide attack. A common example is the many times of Akmorn that hit 4 or so times. You can also use Panhaima in anticipation of a single hit, just remember that shortly after, the remaining stacks will be turned into healing, so you may benefit from not spending other healing cooldowns in that time frame if possible. At level 82, doses 2, Eucrasian doses 2, Phlegma 2, Dyscrasia, and Toxicon are all upgraded 1 level up. Phlegma 3's damage output is still so high you should always use it on cooldown. Dyscrasia 2 is better than doses 3 on 2 or more targets. Toxicon 2 is equal to doses 3 on single target and so can be used for movement without losing any damage. For AoE, Toxicon 2 is always better than Dyscrasia 2, however, I would still recommend you keep at least 1, if not 2 Adderstings for movement reasons. Eucrasian doses 3 is better than Dyscrasia 2 on 2 targets after at least 15 seconds, 3 targets after 24 seconds, and 4 targets after 30 seconds. You should continue applying Eucrasian doses 3 on 3 to 4 enemies as the tank is pulling in dungeon context. At level 85, the potencies of Diagnosis and Kardia are improved, and at the same time, the shield sizes of Eucrasian Diagnosis and Eucrasian Prognosis are increased. This does not really change anything for your playstyle, and the increases are relatively the same across the board, so their relative power are mostly the same when compared to each other. At level 86, you learn the ability Krasis, which increases the healing received by a target for a bit. This can be very useful for applying a large Eucrasian diagnosis, or if your tank needs extra healing in general. For the sake of clarity, Kardia's healing is also increased by Krasis, so it is possible to stack Soteria and Krasis together, for instance, to boost the passive healing you get while attacking. The primary target of this ability is likely always the tank. Outside of using it preemptively to apply a large shield, you can also use it after the tank takes a big hit to bring them back up more easily. Or, as mentioned before, to boost the passive healing you do for a bit, which can be easily useful in dungeon pulls. At level 88, the cooldown of Zoe is reduced. Due to its niche usability, you should still consider using it whenever you plan to use a healing spell. Sometimes using Zoe may be excessive though, so remember to keep Zoe for later if there's a bigger opportunity coming. In fact, I like to use Zoe for the level 90 spell when possible, even though their cooldowns don't always align. Speaking of which, at level 90, you learn the spell Pneuma, the signature laser cannon spell of the Sage. This attack does damage equivalent to Toxicon 2, slightly more AoE on a cast time, so for the damage alone, this is absolutely not worth it. But it also heals everyone for a massive amount. As such, because this is a spell and does both healing and damage, it activates both Kardia and Zoe, but Zoe will not boost the healing from Kardia. Still, Zoe into Pneuma equates to a massive 900 potency AoE heal, so this is a very strong option after the raid takes a big hit, especially if you know you need to take another one in quick succession. Remember that you can use Zoe preemptively, as it is only spent by healing spells, so if you know you won't use Diagnosis or Prognosis, but will need Pneuma in a bit, you can use Zoe up to 30 seconds beforehand. Even if this attack looks incredibly flashy, it is important that its usefulness is mostly as a reactive measure to heal after a big attack. This should not be used on cooldown. Now, to round off, let's start with an attack opener. Then we talk about Addersgall usage, and after that I will suggest some ways you can combine your cooldowns to make the most of them, either in a dungeon context or raid. Finally, we briefly touch on stat priorities. For an opener example, make sure before combat to apply Kardia to the main tank preferably. Keep in mind you can change the Kardia target every 5 seconds if you need to move it to a player that will benefit from the healing. Then, 10 seconds before combat begins, use Eucrasia, then depending on what the fight demands, either apply Eucrasian Diagnosis to the tank or Eucrasian Prognosis to the raid to apply shields to everyone preemptively. Optionally, you can also add Zoe to this cast, in which case it may be beneficial to cast Zoe even earlier in advance. Casting 10 seconds early is done to make sure you recover all the mana before combat starts. Next, about 1.5 seconds before boss pull, start casting doses and then follow up with Eucrasian doses. After that, cast Phlegma twice. In a coordinated group setting, it may be beneficial to delay the Phlegma casts 1 or 2 GCDs to line up with raid buffs, but otherwise it is probably better to use at least one immediately so the cooldown starts. If you plan to use tinctures, you can use the first one 3 seconds before pull, which should mean the animation lock from using it should have ended in time to use doses as planned. When nothing else is available, you just repeatedly cast doses, remembering to reapply Eucrasian doses and using Phlegma as they come up. Now, before moving on to spending Addersgall, a little spoiler warning. The footage that we'll be playing will be from one of the optional level 90 dungeons, so it will be mostly irrelevant to the main story, but some may still find this to be too spoilery. This footage will continue for the rest of the video, so if you want to avoid seeing it, you can choose to simply listen to the rest of the video, or come back later once you feel safe doing so. For spending Addersgall, you should always prefer to use Kerachole on cooldown, although you You should wait if no one is taking damage, and if you know a raid-wide attack is coming up, it may be beneficial to use Kerachole just before that lands instead. Kerachole is a very strong option to use for healing the tank, but try to displace it such that you don't override Kerachole's damage reduction effect. When used efficiently, you can chain Kerachole and Kerachole to grant the tank the damage reduction effect for at least 45 seconds at a time. Adding in Holos too can give you minutes with no downtime of this effect. Kerachole is a great option for healing the raid, and is probably aside from Kerachole your best value to spend Addersgall on. In case of raid-wide damage, it is not a bad idea to use Kerachole just before the hit lands, and then use Kerachole to bring people up to safe health levels again afterwards. Finally, to heal individuals quickly, Kerachole is a good option. Just be careful you don't spend too many Addersgalls on it due to how fast you can spam it. Next, I will go over some cooldown combinations that I personally find very useful. This is, however, more relevant in dungeons than in raids, as raids often mean that you find the perfect answer to each individual mechanic as you go through. They are more fight specific. During pulls, while the tank is rounding up enemies, you may find it very useful to apply Ukrasian diagnosis both before they start pulling and also to reapply it while they're still pulling. This will net you 2 adder stings per pull and should mean your tank is in a better condition once they reach a standstill. Once pulling ends, once the tank reaches a standstill, using Kerachole plus Panhaima or Panhaima will give you breathing room to do a lot of damage at the start of a fight. For particularly difficult pulls, adding in Soteria or Krasis, or both, can help too. As Kerachole runs out, if the tank is expected to continue taking a lot of damage, use Physis and then Kerachole when the tank will benefit from the full heal. Make sure that Physis is used first, as it boosts the healing that Kerachole will do. If the fight drags on beyond this, you can cycle back to Kerachole, but after that, even adding in Holos may likely require you to start applying more Ukrasian diagnosis to the tank if the fight isn't about to end. When a raid-wide is incoming, Kerachole about 2 seconds before the attack comes, then use Kerachole afterwards. Alternatively, use Zoe as much in advance as you can predict it, and then use Pneuma to heal everyone immediately after the attack lands. Finally, regarding stat priorities, keep in mind that in nearly all situations, item level beats these secondary stats and should always be weighed higher outside of niche cases. While sages should receive all the mana they will need from a combination of Addersgall and Lucid Dreaming, Piety, as a stat that increases mana regeneration, should always be considered until you feel comfortable with your mana quantities. It should, however, be thought of as a safety net, and you should try to look for ways to optimize your mana usage rather than stack Piety excessively. After that, critical hit is always a high value stat, since it both increases your healing potential and your damage potential and tends to scale better than the competition. Next after that, direct hit boosts your damage considerably but does not affect your healing, so if you prefer to be more balanced, you can choose to favor determination instead. Just keep in mind that direct hit tends to do more damage, and the extra healing from determination is often not a huge deal to miss out on. On the other hand, as of the making of this guide, determination is expected to be extremely close to direct hit in damage value too, so perhaps this extra healing is superior. I will leave you to make that decision yourself. It should be noted that direct hit will never be found directly on healer gear and is gained exclusively through materia. Finally, spell speed is another option to increase your damage and in some cases your healing. Keep in mind that the faster you cast spells, the faster you spend your mana. It is very common for healers to favor a GCD of about 2.4 or slightly slower than that. Sage in particular favors as little spell speed as possible, partly due to the fact that a large amount of your damage comes from phlegma, and you will not get extra phlegmas from more spell speed. In general, item levels should be your main concern, and then look to optimize with the different options of the same item level. If you want to optimize these things, I advise you to seek out communities in the game that focus on these aspects, as anything that I suggest can be outdated tomorrow. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or found something a bit confusing, please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, Sage's spell names appear to be Greek inspired. As far as my knowledge carries me, a lot of the spell names are medical in nature. However, I personally don't understand it at all, so I feel any examples I might give would be inaccurate.